after Sunday's death of the longest living president in American history. President Jimmy Carter died yesterday at his home in Plains, Georgia. He was 100 years old. Flags are flying at half-staff at the White House and across the nation in tribute to his long service to the nation. President Joe Biden set a national day of mourning. That's for January the 9th, 2025. The New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ paused for a moment of silence this morning before trading began. Carter served one term in the White House after being elected as the 39th president back in 1976. The peanut farmer, Navy officer, former governor of Georgia, Nobel Peace Prize winner and lifelong Democrat took office in the middle of the Cold War after defeating Republican President Gerald Ford. He brokered a Middle East peace deal between Israel and Egypt and Camp David. That was back in 1978. But his time in office was marked by double-digit inflation, the 1979 oil shock that caused gas shortages, and the Iranian hostage crisis. Here to help us look back on the life and the legacy of President Jimmy Carter in a Fox Business exclusive is James McInyre, who served as the director of the Office of Management and Budget during the Carter administration. James, welcome.
Thank you, Lauren.
As I listed all of those wonderful things about President Jimmy Carter, he really was the Renaissance man. We didn't write that in addition to being a diplomat, he wrote children's books, he was a poet, he was a woodworker. What a man.
He loved music of all types.
Add that.
But he was also known as the rock and roll president. He loved rock and roll music. I worked for Jimmy Carter for 4 years in Georgia. I worked for him 2 years as the Deputy Revenue Commissioner, and then 2 years as the Director of the Office of Planning and Budget, which was a key component of the governor's office. And then I came to Washington and worked for him as the first of all, the Deputy Director of the Office of Management and Budget. But after Burt Lance resigned, I became the Director and was the Director for the rest of the time. So I've known Jimmy Carter pretty well for a number of years. And I can say that he was a very dedicated person. He had goals in mind, and he was very ambitious and tried to tackle a number of problems that he saw facing the nation, and I thought he did a good job, and I thought he accomplished a lot more than some people want to give him credit for.
He had said about 10 years ago, he was doing an interview, and he's reflecting on his time as president, and he said he should have taken military action in Iran when they stormed the U.S. Embassy and took American hostages and held them for 444 days. He said that cost him re-election. Would you agree?
Well, I think it was a major influence over his loss. And I think the other thing is when he decided not to, the Rose Garden strategy, in which he decided to not get out and campaign until the hostages were released. I think that together that really did have a significant impact on his ability to be reelected. No one knows, because we don't know what would have happened had there been a military action.
Yeah.
But it certainly was an important, I think, a very important reason that he was not reelected.
One of his greatest accomplishments was the Camp David Accord, the peace deal between Israel and Egypt, which has endured to this day. Looking at the chaos in the Middle East, what have we learned from that deal struck back in 1978 that still endures?
Well, I think that when you have a deal that the people, the participants in the deal feel that are fair to both sides and address a continuing series of wars that have been going on between Egypt and Israel, that makes for a long-lasting peace treaty, and I think that's what happened here. I had to go over to Israel and Egypt and assess the types of things that the United States was going to provide funding for, and I can tell you that it was a relief to many to see this peace treaty adopted by the participants.
Yeah. One of the other issues that he dealt with during his presidency that we are talking about now is the issue of the Panama Canal. President Carter gave control of the canal to Panama, and now President-elect Donald Trump may want to reclaim it. He says Panama is perhaps ripping the United States off. Would you take that on?
You know, I wouldn't. I would leave it alone. I think it served our country well. If there's some issues about the charges that are being levied for our use of the canal, then I would take that on maybe. But the fact is that returning the canal to Panama saved us a lot of trouble with other Central and South American countries. I think it was the right thing to do. And if we've got problems with the way it's run, then take those up with Panama. I think it would be a very difficult thing to take the canal back, and it could cause a lot of concern in Congress and in the country to try to do that at this time.
What is your favorite memory, James, of President Carter, whether personal or professional?
Well, my favorite memory is working with him. He was always, he was very focused on the problems or issues at hand. And the reason I enjoyed being with him for the 8 years I was with him is that I could always count on him to look at my memos and to give me some feedback. And he also was a person who tried to do the right thing. I can remember many occasions where we would give him a number of choices about how to deal with a public policy issue. And there would be a lot of controversy about those choices. And he would turn to me and say, you know, what is the right option? What is the best option for our country? And I always felt that was important.
Yeah.
And it made me, feel that he was much more concerned about the country than himself or any particular group. So that's my favorite memory, is working with him and having him really focus on the issues that we presented to him and make good decisions.
A man of high morals. I called him a Renaissance man at the top of this segment. James McInyre, thank you for the time and for your stories and your memories.